Thanks, Cam. And thanks for the opportunity to be here and speak about my historical novel, The Rome Gospel. This is actually the third novel in a series that attempts to shed light on particular books of the New Testament. The first one was entitled The Ephesus Scroll. And that one we really looked at the book of Revelation about when it was written, why it was written, and most importantly, to who it was written. I want to quickly just give a little bit of an aside at this point and say why I ended up writing historical fiction. It's not the usual thing for faculty members, New Testament scholars to do, although there are a couple of people out there that are doing it. People like Ben Witherington has done some. But mostly they don't write fiction, they write commentaries. Now, if you're a student, a commentary is a good thing when you're researching an essay and or preparing for a sermon. But how many people do you think that are attending church on a regular Sunday ever pick up a commentary? Not many, okay? There might be a few nerds out there. Look, once you're a Bible college student, you are a nerd, and you will be the sort of person that will pick up a commentary. But the average pew sitter doesn't, okay? And I feel like that's a bit of a shame, because there's a lot of brilliant material in commentaries and in journal articles and so forth that really helps to explain the New Testament, or the Old Testament, but the New Testament's my particular area of interest. And so when I came, the story behind this book, this first one, there was a couple of things that happened that helped me, inspire me to write the Ephesus Scroll. One of them was attending Ephesus. I got to visit Ephesus in 2004, and if you ever get a chance to do a tour of Jerusalem or Greece or Turkey, take it, because it is absolutely phenomenal. And I just remember standing on the flagstones in Ephesus and going, Paul stood on these flagstones. That's just, and we sat in the theatre where the people were crying out, Artemis of the Ephesians, and Paul wanted to go out and speak to them. That was the spot, the actual spot. It was just, I'd been to Bible college at that point, but this, it was like, wow, it really happened. And it happened here. So that was the first thing. The second thing, I was a teacher in a high school in St. Petersburg, teaching Bible. And I don't know if you know the Left Behind series. Apologies if anyone is a big fan. But I happened to say in this Bible class that I thought that the Left Behind series was a travesty of biblical interpretation. And a guy at the back put his hand up and said, then how can you be teaching in a Christian school? The implication being that if you don't believe that premillennial dispensational approach to Revelation, you can't be a Christian. In other words, that's the only way of interpreting that book. And I was just flabbergasted. And so basically I thought, where is he getting that? Maybe his church, but probably because he's read the Left Behind books. And he doesn't know that there are alternative interpretations, which we get when we come to, first year New Testament class, and you suddenly realise that there is so many options, and you try and work out which one you think is the most likely, and maybe you come to a conclusion, maybe you don't, but at least you know there are options. This guy didn't know. So I thought, right, someone has to write something, a popular sort of fiction thing that will put that an alternative interpretation. And then it sort of dawned on me that I should probably be that person, or at least I should give it a try. So that was the Ephesus Scroll. More recently, having started here at MST, I started the Writers Guild, and the idea was to encourage you students in your creative writing work. And then it dawned on me that I should be doing something too. I can't just be telling students to be writing stuff. I really should be doing it too. So the Corinth letters came about as a result of that. And it looks at the Church of Corinth, and it fills in the background to Paul's there's more than two letters. and hopefully sort of explains a little bit about what's going on in those two letters. But again, it does it in historical fiction form. Now, both of these books have two timelines. There's a timeline set in the first century and a timeline set in the present day. And the action jumps back and forth between those two timelines. Now, I did that deliberately. One, it's sort of interesting for the reader. You know, you read up a section, there's a bit of a cliffhanger, and then it's not immediately resolved. You go to the other timeline and you have to wait. And so it can be a bit frustrating, but it hopefully keeps you reading. But the second reason was because I wanted to address two questions. What did the book mean for those who first received it, in the case of the book of Revelation or the letters of Corinth? But then second question is, what do they mean for us today? So having a 21st century timeline helped to sort of allow that to happen. Well, this third novel is a little bit different. This time, the action only takes place in the first century. So this is a true work of historical fiction. But what hasn't changed is I'm still trying to explain the background of New Testament books. In this case, we're looking at the Gospel of Mark and selected portions from the book of Acts. Most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel to be written. But what led Mark to write it? And how did he construct it? And who was it written for? These are the sort of questions that scholars ask. The problem is the answers are rather elusive. We only really know that between the time of Jesus and the writing of the Gospels, the stories of Jesus were shared orally. And this oral history was shared from person to person in the early church. And it's this oral history that Mark would have used when he came to write down in his Gospel. Okay, question for you. Was this oral history made up of hundreds of fragmentary, unconnected stories about Jesus, all mixed up with little bits of his teaching? Or did this oral history come to have a distinct shape? Now, my personal opinion is that it would have had a distinct shape, so that when people in the early church were telling the story of Jesus, they started with John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. They then followed that with selected highlights of Jesus' ministry and his teaching, before describing in greater detail the passion and the resurrection, and then finishing with the commissioning of the apostles. So when Mark came to write his gospel, my understanding is that he simply followed the structure of this oral history. Now, I have one important piece of evidence for this view, and that is that the beginning and end of Mark's gospel show signs that they were damaged. Now, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. If you did first year New Testament last semester, you would have covered a little bit of this. But I think that the fact that the beginning and end of Mark have been damaged actually says something about why Mark wrote his gospel down. Suffice it to say, you'll have to read the novel to see if my reconstruction of the situation is convincing. All right, next question. Where did Mark get his oral history from? Potentially, if I'm right, that the account of Jesus became to be, a certain shape of oral history, potentially he got it from someone who could recite that whole oral history from memory. And we get a hint that this might be the case even when we look at the start of Luke. In Luke chapter 1, he refers to servants of the word. And these could be people that had memorised the account of Jesus and would then speak it in church. We don't have any way of knowing who Mark's source was, or if there was more than one or whatever. And so I've applied a little creative license. In Romans chapter 16, Paul refers to a Jewish couple. If you look at verse 7, he says, he tells the Roman church to greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who have been in prison with me. More than that, he goes on to say that they are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. because this verse implies that the couple were apostles, some people from the Middle Ages onwards decided that Junior was actually Junius. If you look in the NIV, that's what it says, Junius. In other words, they made Junior a man. But unfortunately for them, there is absolutely no evidence from the first century that there was a masculine form of that particular name. None whatsoever. It's all female, Junior. So Junior really was a woman. And it seems that Paul in this verse refers to her as an apostle and someone who was a Christian before he was. Well, a couple of scholars have recently suggested that Junior is the Latin name for Joanna. Joanna was one of the women we know from Luke who financially supported Jesus' ministry. She also appears as a witness to the crucifixion and the resurrection. And I actually think that this is quite a plausible identification for Junior, someone who could be an outstanding apostle, someone that brings the word and plants the church. And so I've run with that in this book. So my novel will follow essentially the process of Mark writing his gospel down while Junior recites it from memory. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of increased persecution that's happening in Rome following the Great Fire that happened in AD 64. Well, while the whole novel is set in the first century, there is still some jumping back and forth. I like to keep my readers on their toes, because I've given Mark a whole lot of flashbacks. Because Mark has quite a lot of connections to the early church himself. We know from the book of Acts that when Peter is miraculously freed from prison, he goes to Mark's mother's house, where they're having a prayer meeting on his behalf. And while Acts does not explicitly confirm this, Mark's mother's house is also quite possibly the place where the Holy Spirit fell on Pentecost and the place where Jesus celebrated the Last Supper. The Eastern Orthodox Church has made that connection. And of course we know that Mark went with Paul and Barnabas on the initial stage of their first missionary journey, and he was the reason for Paul and Barnabas' big argument and parting of the ways. But by the end of Paul's life, Mark has somehow managed to become one of his ministry team again. So the character of Mark is a fascinating one, and it was a lot of fun imagining events in Acts from his perspective. Well, I think that should be enough for me at the moment, just to say what this novel is about. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Colin Cruz just to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's been my privilege to read Ben's 3 historical novels in their manuscript form and then say a few words about them. And I want to tell you that this guy is a remarkable person and his books are remarkable books. And I say that without any hesitation. As Ben indicated, there are very few New Testament historical novels. I know of only one, there may be others. I know the one by Gerd Tyson, The Shadow of the Galilean, where he tries to describe the background of Jesus' ministry and to flesh it out so you can feel what it was like to be around when Jesus was conducting his ministry. A remarkable book, and one which I've often recommended to first-year students to read to get a feel for what it was like to be around when Jesus was conducting his ministry. But I know of no other. I think Ben mentioned one, I didn't know that one. But the difficulty with historical novels sometimes is that they play fast and loose with historical data, and the scholarship supporting them is lacking. Well, one of the things that I've admired about Ben's writing in all 3 of his historical novels is that they're based on a sound understanding of New Testament teaching. There's a point where, of course, he has to fill that out with imagination and historical reconstruction, but you feel, as you read through these books, you feel you're in good hands, that this person is not playing fast and loose with the teaching of the New Testament. You feel you're in the hands of somebody who knows what he's talking about and is exercising his imagination to show you to give you an idea of what it must have been like when these events took place. I was particularly impressed when I read through the book. I read it through again yesterday, scanned it very quickly in preparation for being with you today. I was impressed, something I hadn't picked up the first time, that Mark's Gospel, if it's written as we think in about AD 65, then it's within a year of the Great Fire of Rome and the breaking out of persecution of Christian people. And so when you read Ben's book about the Rome Gospel, Mark is on the run the whole time. He starts in Cyrene and he goes to Jerusalem, then he ends up in Rome. He's sitting with Junia as she recites the tradition of Jesus, and then he has to go back home, but he has to go through the back streets of Rome because there's a man, an agent of the Roman authorities that's trying to kill him. So you've got all this tension. They're trying to get this thing written before Mark gets killed. I never ever thought of Mark writing his gospel. I thought he'd be like me, sitting in his study, writing his work at leisure. But no, he's on the run and his life's in danger as the Christian church is under persecution as he writes the first account of Jesus' ministry. The other thing I found interesting was the way in which Ben brought into his account of Mark's writing of this gospel flashbacks, as he calls them, into Mark's experience in mission. This was very, very helpful because it gives us a feel, as you read that, and as Ben exercised his imagination to fill out what it must have been like, you get a feel for what mission was like in the first century. Now, for many years I taught biblical theology of mission, and I can tell you that most books on biblical theology of mission are very rewarding, but they're hard going. To read Ben's novel, historical novel, where he touches on Mark's involvement in mission, his involvement with Paul the Apostle, his involvement with Barnabas, it gives you a feel for the cost of mission and how it was actually done. And it's one thing to get a sort of a abstract understanding of mission theology. It's another thing to get a feel for what it was like to be involved in it. And this is what he does for us. Very remarkable. He's a remarkable man, and this is a remarkable book. The other thing which I found really helpful was as Mark is recording the tradition of Jesus as he hears it from Junia, there's interaction with the actual story of Jesus, there's interaction with the teaching of Jesus, and what you find, both in respect of Mark's gospel and also when he's telling the story of Mark's involvement in mission in respect of the Acts of the Apostle, that you are getting an illuminating commentary on those two books of the New Testament in a way that is easily assimilated and it's not hard going. I'm sorry to say that a lot of New Testament scholarship is very, on the one hand, it's very rewarding, of course I'd have to say that. On the other hand, it's often very hard going. It takes a lot of concentration, and one of the great things about these historical novels is that it gives you not only an abstract idea but a feel for what's going on in a way which is not only easy to assimilate, but actually engaging, and can you believe it, it's hard to put down. How many books have you read in your studies that you've found hard to put down? Well, it's a great blessing to read a book that's hard to put down. Now, I'm not going to go on and on. I was expecting to have 2 minutes today, 2 out of 10, so this is a blessing. We go to morning tea a bit earlier. But last year I had the pleasure of teaching a course on 2 Corinthians in the postgrad MA class. And so, being a good friend of Ben, I put on the reading list the Corinth letters, his book. And so they all bought a copy of the Corinth letters. And one student at least he read the Corinth letters. He was so taken with it, he ran out and got the Ephesus scroll as well. Now that's a pretty good endorsement. If you ever read a book by some person and the next thing you do is go out and buy his other one, that's a good endorsement of the work that that person has done. And I don't think you can get a much better endorsement than that from the people for whom the book is intended. You can get great ones to write stuff about your books, and they feel obliged to do it because you're their friend. But when the student reads one of your books and runs out straight away and gets another one by the same author, then that is a fantastic endorsement. And as I said at the beginning, the Rome Gospel is a remarkable book, and the writer is a remarkable person. MST is lucky to have him, and if he ever gives any indication that he's going to leave, you talk to Tim and make sure he doesn't. But it's a great pleasure, therefore, for me to add my own endorsement and to congratulate Ben on what I believe is a wonderful, creative and informative and, what else would I say, just a wonderful book. So I commend it to you.
Oh, thanks, Colin, so much for those very encouraging words. Well, if you want to buy a copy, I have a table at the back, or two. The paperback is $15, and I have the other books in the series there as well. Now, you don't have to read them in order, but there are some connections between the books, so if that's an important thing for you, then start with the Ephesus scroll. And there are also ebooks available for all of these. I have a little flyer out on the table which will help you find the ebooks for your specific device. But basically, just search for Ben Chenoweth on your device's bookshop and it should find it fairly easily. The ebooks are a little cheaper. They are only $5 for the second and third book. The first one, Ephesus Scroll, is free. Actually, it's not free on Amazon because I can't set it to make it free on Amazon because Amazon is just... But it should be free from Smashwords. If you're interested in getting a taste, you'll be able to do that with the ebook. All right, well, thanks again. I have some other thank yous. I wanted to thank MST Press because, they're publishing these books and I'm really, really grateful. In particular, Peter Riddell and Justin Tan. Thanks for being willing to extend the boundaries of MST Press to cover historical fiction. I'd also like to thank Gillian and Sue for reading early drafts of the manuscript and making very helpful corrections. And last but definitely not least, the members of the Writers Guild of 2016. Specifically, Nicola, Craig, Christina and Bert. Thanks for listening to excerpts from this novel and making very helpful suggestions, but most of all, encouraging me to keep writing to get it done. So thanks so much. And thanks everyone for coming. Let's enjoy some morning tea.